Hello everyone, my name is Marisol Schulz. I'm the General Director of the Guadalajara International Book Fair in Mexico. First of all, I want to thank everyone involved in the very prestigious Lillehammer Literature Festival, especially Marit Borkenhagen. As you know, this has been a very rough year for everyone around the world, and festivals, literary festivals, have had to reinvent themselves in order to propose new ways to reach and connect with their audiences. So I celebrate the opportunity that I have now to talk with you from my house in Guadalajara, Mexico. I also want to take a minute to recognize the support and the multiple efforts of the Mexican ambassador to Norway, the Honorable Mr. Ulises Canchola. He's really been very important in the connection of the cultural world of Mexico with your country. As the current director of one of the most important literature festivals in the Spanish-speaking world, it's also a book fair, as you know, I want to talk in a more personal way, explaining why I have dedicated my whole life to books, to reading promotion, and to organize cultural activities such as the Guadalajara International Book Fair. So forgive me if I tell a little bit of my personal life. I need to do so in order to say why I became a literary editor. Well, I grew up in an environment, a familiar environment, where books and culture were important. My parents, my grandparents, my whole family encouraged my reading in different stages of my life and managed to provide me, in early stages, with books that were interesting for me in the early age. So I became an eager reader since I have the memory. Perhaps when I was 4 years old, I started to read. They provide interesting books, and as a kid, as many kids, I went from fairy tales to adventures to fables, and later on to children's novels, such as the ones, for instance, of Louise May Alcott, Little Women, or adventure books such as Robinson Crusoe, just to name a few. Later on, when I was a teenager, that was like a fashion for us as teenagers to start reading the writers of a movement, a literary movement called the Boom, the Latin American Boom. And those writers were, of course, the wonderful and amazing Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I read at that time 100 Years of Solitude. I also read some of Julio Cortázar's short stories. And of course, a writer that later on was very important for me, Carlos Fuentes. I think I didn't quite understand all of what they said in their very personal and original style. It's impossible for a teenager to have that concept of everything that they are saying. But I also think that all of those works made a huge impact on me. So, for instance, when I was 17 years old, I read The Death of Artemio Cruz by Carlos Fuentes. And I recall the story, I know the story, I know some of the style, it's a very characteristic style. But what I remember the most is that when I finished reading the book, I said to myself, this is a path I want to continue for my whole life. Call it an instinct, I don't know. But I knew I have to be connected with literature in a way or another. it was like a definition. Of course, I didn't know, but at that time, that some of those things were going to be true. So, well, later on, after university and after finishing some of my studies in history, Mexican history, I didn't study literature. I started working as an academic editor in some of the university presses in the National University of Mexico, in Mexico City. And in 1993, I was called and hired by the very prestigious Spanish literary imprint Alfaguara. And I was hired to be the literary editor. I can tell you the first manuscript I had in my hands, the first book I had to edit and later on publish, was El Naranjo, The Orange Tree by Carlos Fuentes. That was in 1993. So can you imagine for a young, very young reader, a very young editor, who by then was one of the most admirers of Carlos Fuentes, to have in her hands the responsibility of editing one of Carlos Fuentes' manuscripts, that was El Naranjo. I did so, and I think I read that book at least 5 times, trying to find out if there were any mistakes or if there were any kind of suggestions I could make. And of course, you can imagine how nervous I was. At that time, 1993, young people perhaps won't know it, we didn't have a computer. We didn't have a mail to connect with the authors. We have to do so with a fax and sometimes by phone. Well, El Naranjo was the start of my career as a literary editor, as a literary fiction editor. And I managed to do the job in that very peculiar way, talking with Mr. Carlos Fuentes by phone, asking him some doubts. And I think that the job came out pretty well. I mean, he was well known by then, very well known by then, not only in Mexico, but also in all of the Spanish-speaking world and many other countries as well. And the job we did in Mexico was the same edition that later on was released in Spain and the Latin American countries, the rest of the Latin American countries, and even in the United States. As you know, many people in the United States speak Spanish, so we also did an edition that was released in the United States. That was the beginning. That was the beginning of a career, as I say, in which, I say the literary editor is not a common reader. It's a very uncommon reader because the editor has to dig into the text, has to analyze, has to become the double in a way of the author, the bodyguard of the author. Do you remember that film by the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa? The film was called Kagemusha, and it was like the shadow of the warrior. Kagemusha was hired to be the double of a nobleman, and he did all of his job. Well, I wasn't able to be the double of any writer, and it was not my job. But in a certain way, I was the shadow of the writer regarding his text. I had to cover him or her, and to know that if there were any failures, any mistakes, those were the faults and the mistakes of the editor. On the other hand, if the book was well, no problem with the book, that was only because of the author. The way I see the literary editor is that you have to be there and not to be noticed. If they know that you are there, is that the book is not well done, that your job is not well done. That was my philosophy, and after Carlos Fuentes, that was, I repeat, 1993, there were so many others, many other good American writers, good Latin American writers, wonderful Mexican writers. And some of the most complicated jobs that I did were with authors that were deaf. For instance, with Julio Cortázar, I had the versions, different versions of his novel Modelo para Armar, one of the most wonderful novels I have ever read. And after comparing with different versions, I had to come with a new one with in my opinion. That was the same case later on when I worked with a definite version of Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo in a different publishing house. So if I have to say the list of some of the writers I've worked with, I could tell you I have worked with Augusto Monterroso, who was a Guatemalan writer and lived in Mexico during most of his adult life as a refugee in Mexico. Álvaro Mutis, Sergio Ramírez, Mexican writers like Ángeles Mastreta, Héctor Aguilar Camín, Carmen Boullosa, Elena Poniatowska, and I think I have the honor to be the publisher, the editor and the publisher of many writers that at the time that came to me were not that well known. And after some job made with them, now they are very prestigious writers. That's part of my baggage as well. So when it comes to say about my job and to talk about my job, I can tell you that's the challenge. The challenge is to know that you are not the protagonist of the story, that you have to be the shadow, and to read the book in a very different way. Everyone who has read a book as an editor knows that we read with a book with a pencil in our hands, and we are trying to find not only the hidden gems but also the pearls. In Spanish, the word pearl, perla, has another meaning. It's not only a gem, not only a good thing, but finding a pearl, a perla, means finding a grammar mistake or a big mistake. That's something that you have to avoid. You have to avoid that the book comes out with such a big mistake. So in many of the books I work with, for instance, I have to write down all of the dates, all of the years, if it was a big novel, a historical novel, and I had to follow the story during the years, the chronology of the story, to know if it was true. So many times I found mistakes regarding the chronology, or things that were supposed to happen in some year, let's say something that happened in 1917 and couldn't happen that year. And it was very funny to go with the author, even though he were a prestigious, anyone, he or she, a prestigious writer, and tell him or her, this is a mistake, it's not possible. In 1917, that didn't exist. But I can tell you most of the prestigious writers, the well-known writers, respect the job of a literary editor. And they not only respected me, but also thanked me because of that. And just to close the cycle, I have to tell you that the last book I edited as an editor was Adam in Eden by Carlos Fuentes, again, in 2010, in the year 2010. So that's why Fuentes has been part of my life in a cycle. Is one of the first books I read. The first book I published and edited was by Carlos Fuentes, and the last book I edited was by Carlos Fuentes. I think I have been very lucky, and now I'm very thankful to be part of the literary world in a very different way. I thank you all, and I hope to see you sometime in Mexico in the Guadalajara International Book Fair. Bye-bye.